Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly. Today I am really excited because I am finally introducing some new content to this channel, which is honestly something I have wanted to do for a long time, and that is to do a podcast. Oftentimes because of either a time constraint or monetization requirements, I'm not able to talk about what I would consider to be really critical parts of a tornado event, whether that be talking about anxiety or PTSD or a lack of funding, hard-hitting truths about injuries and fatalities, clickbait. I mean, there's a lot of things I don't normally have the time to discuss, and that's exactly what this podcast is for. I know some of you will be curious, but these episodes are not going to be disrupting my main channel content. Don't worry, my regular videos are not going anywhere. And because many of these episodes, including this one, are going to be on more sensitive discussions, they will not be monetized at all. So because we're going to have a podcast of sorts, we will need a name, but I thought it would be fun for us to name this together. So if you all have any ideas that you would like to share, please leave them in the comments below. We will gather a few of the favorite ones and we'll vote on our favorite one, and that will be our name. I did make an Instagram for this account as well. It's called Americano Carly, and of course I do still have a Twitter if you all are interested. I also want to say a quick thank you to Gabriel of Chaser Chat, who has honestly really helped encourage me to get this ball rolling. I was on his podcast a few weeks ago and it's incredible. I really admire Gabriel as an interviewer. He's had on guests on Chaser Chat like Pecos Hank, Skip Talbot, Liz Lightman, and it's really, along with Weather Brains, my favorite podcast to listen to, and it really gives me my fill of weather content that I need. So if you haven't checked it out, go check it out. I just wanted to give him a quick plug. For anyone who has been asking about a membership, I do get asked this quite a bit. I will be doing memberships in the near future. I just want to make sure that I can provide you all with some kind of consistent content or something beneficial that you would enjoy. So it is something that I am working on. I just don't want to do memberships until I can provide you all with something in return. So give me just a little bit more time and I'll have something out. And finally, before we get into the video, I have two really important things. The first one is a disclaimer. I am not a mental health professional, and I don't want anyone to be under the impression that I am. I am not here today to give mental health advice. We are here to have an open discussion. All of the research that we're going to be referencing today is done by actual professionals who are infinitely more brilliant than I am, and everything outside of that is just going to be my own opinion. The second thing I have to get out of the way is a trigger warning. Today's episode, like many of the other ones that we're going to have, will be a little bit more graphic and sensitive in nature. Today we're going to be discussing anxiety, depression. We're going to be talking briefly about suicide. We're also briefly going to be talking about injuries. So if that is something you are not interested in hearing, I don't recommend today's video for you. And if you normally watch my videos with your young adults or children, I also don't recommend today's video for them either. So with all of that out of the way, let's get right into it. Today's topic is survivor's guilt, and I wanted to give a really quick background as to why I chose this topic, why survivor's guilt, and kind of what it has to do with this channel. Part of what we're going to discuss today, and really the overarching theme of this podcast, is that survivor's guilt, along with a slew of other mental repercussions from tornadoes, do exist post-tornado, and they are things that often get overlooked, whether that be in tornado documentaries or in discussions, or anytime you hear about a tornado event. These are things that commonly get overlooked, and that's really what this podcast is for. To amplify those really important topics that we don't normally get to dive into. And that might include things that may be a little bit harder to talk about, but they're important and they exist. So that brings us to today. We're going to talk about survivor's guilt. We're going to explore what survivor's guilt is specific to tornado disasters. We're going to talk about what it looks like and how it manifests. We're going to take a look at some notable examples of survivor's guilt post-tornado, and we're going to examine some of the reasons why it's not discussed more, and of course what we can do moving forward. What is survivor's guilt pertaining to the weather enterprise, and more specifically pertaining to tornadoes? We know that the effects of tornadoes are long-lasting, long after the tornado lifts, long after the cleanup process, and frankly, long after the town completely rebuilds. The impacts and lasting trauma that occur reverberate through the entire town that's hit. And it reverberates to those who aren't even directly impacted. It's a ripple effect. There's an article written by Joanne Lorber for the International Fire Chiefs Association, and it's titled Surviving Survivor's Guilt, and I wanted to read an excerpt from it. Natural disasters happen every year across the world, be it hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, tornadoes, whatever it is. And those who survive and were present or witnessed those events can and oftentimes will experience some form of survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt is extremely complex, and it looks different for everybody. It can take form in feelings of extreme sadness, depression, feelings of helplessness, or guilt that you survived while someone else lost their life or had it worse in some capacity. Many therapists actually view survivor's guilt as a secondary symptom, of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that survivor's guilt only occurs later, after the trauma has occurred, once that traumatized individual is trying to go back to their daily life. So what does survivor's guilt look like, and how does it manifest? Psychological responses to traumatic events naturally look different for everyone, but here are some of the most common symptoms that we know of. Symptoms of survivor's guilt can mimic those of PTSD and can include mood swings or angry outbursts, social problems or isolation, trouble sleeping and anxiety, guilt for surviving, obsessive thoughts or reliving the traumatic event, and generalized anxiety, suicidal thoughts, etc. According to published research, as many as 4 in 10 survivors can experience mental or behavioral disorders after a disaster, particularly with children, women, and disproportionately impacted communities. For tornadoes specifically, research suggests that up to 1/5 of those who are directly impacted will develop symptoms that are disrupting to daily life for long periods of time. And a lot of times when we talk about the PTSD or survivor's guilt specifically, research points to a very delayed response, as we mentioned. So many times it will be 6 months or more, maybe 3, 6, 9 months before the symptoms really start to manifest and show themselves. And I want to also take this time to say that survivor's guilt is by no means limited to those who are directly impacted by the tornado. It can also happen to any of the service workers, anyone who is actually there to witness the event. So there are plenty of instances of police or firemen or medical professionals, volunteers, or even storm chasers, anyone who's just in the immediate aftermath of a tornado. They are certainly subject to seeing and having to deal with very traumatic sights and situations. Even the most seasoned storm chaser or police officer or medical professional, no one is immune from developing PTSD from something like that. And the result of a lot of these scientific studies that have been published, amongst many other things, one of the main conclusions is that because suicide and depression are on the rise, particularly with youths, and because of climate change, it's critical now more than ever that we start taking action on mental health in natural disasters. And it's really important that we start taking preventative action so that children understand that should something like this happen, they have tools and resources available to them to get the help that they need. So now that we've laid the groundwork a little bit on survivor's guilt and what it is and looks like, let's take a look at some documented cases of survivor's guilt from infamous tornadoes that we know of. We're going to start off talking about Tuscaloosa. A man who I'm going to rename as Ben miraculously survived a direct hit from the April 27th, 2011 Tuscaloosa EF4 in his home. On the afternoon of the storms, as the Tuscaloosa tornado begins to approach the populated areas of town, Ben and 3 other friends decide to huddle in the hallway of their home. But as the twister approaches in the last minute, Ben decides his gut feeling is telling him that the hallway is not going to be safe enough and he needs to get into a closet. Ben is telling his 3 other friends that they should get into the closet with him and that it's going to be much safer. But unfortunately, despite the fact that Ben is pleading for them to come, they all decide to stay in the hallway apart from Ben, who in the very last second gets in the closet by himself. The tornado moves directly over their home and destroys it completely. Shortly after, Ben comes out of what used to be the closet and is home and discovers his 3 friends no longer alive. And one of which, by the way, was his best friend since middle school. Clearly a very traumatic event to have experienced for many reasons. Not only did he survive a hit from, a really incredibly powerful storm, he has to see his 3 friends no longer alive, and that is just a really traumatizing event beyond what I can really comprehend. Soon after the event, Ben would tell his mom that he felt like he should have died with his friends in the hallway. He felt guilty for being alive. Soon after the tornado, Ben had stopped playing guitar and basketball, which were things that he normally really enjoyed doing. And we know that in itself, not doing things that you enjoy anymore, is usually a sign of something more troublesome happening, whether it be depression or feeling a lot of anxiety or whatever it is. It's not a good sign. And Ben wasn't ignorant to that fact either. Ben decided to go to therapy and to try his very best to work through the problems that he had since the tornado. So not only was he going to therapy, Ben also had gotten a girlfriend since the event, and really he was just doing all the things that you are supposed to do after a traumatic event to try to move on with your life. But really tragically, despite working so hard every day to overcome those overwhelming feelings of depression and guilt, Ben would ultimately take his own life just a few years after the Tuscaloosa storm, after texting his mom and saying that this was the worst day that he had ever had. Since the incident, Ben's mom has been really open in saying that she knows it was survivor's guilt that took her son's life. And I think probably the saddest part of this whole thing, the most tragic part, is that, Ben really did try everything that he was supposed to. He really did everything he should have, and it just shows you how altering mentally and really physically these traumatic events are. It's literally like you have a physical gash or a scar on your brain, and it doesn't matter what you do, it's not going away. It's always going to be there. And some days might be better than others, but sometimes it's really crippling. This one will include a brief description of an injury, just so you are aware. A child who I'm going to change the name to Ted was 10 years old in 2013, attending Plaza Towers Elementary when the Moore 2013 twister struck. The storm passes over the school and, as we know, destroyed a large portion of the property and really tragically took the lives of several children. And in that process, Ted was actually impaled by a large piece of wood in his abdomen. Miraculously, rescuers found Ted about 40 minutes later, and although he was physically pretty critically injured, he would be okay. Ted's parents obviously were overjoyed that their son had made it out and was set to make a full recovery. And in the coming months, Ted, while he seemed to be making a good physical recovery, mentally was not okay. Ted had lost 7 friends in the tornado, so this was a really horrific thing for a 10-year-old to have to endure. And despite all of that, Ted had refused over and over again to go to therapy. Ted had insisted to his parents that he was okay, despite them trying their very best to make him go to therapy. He said he would hate them if he made him go to therapy. And very strangely, something that actually makes me really upset about this particular example is that Ted's own pediatrician had assured the parents that children are resilient and Ted will bounce back. And she then attributed his symptoms and changes in behavior to ADHD. And it would actually be much later that Ted's parents took him to another doctor, where that doctor would say, yeah, Ted is experiencing pretty intense symptoms of PTSD and survivor's guilt. In the months and year after the tornado, Ted had completely stopped doing the things that he had enjoyed. He was isolating himself, and he wasn't talking about his trauma to anyone. In fact, one of the only things he did openly say was that he was terrified of death. Ted's sister Sarah was also in the Plaza Towers Elementary School during the tornado. She was in second grade at the time, and she was actually knocked unconscious by debris and thrown 10 yards during the Moore tornado hitting the school. And while her injuries were not as physically intense as Ted, her brothers, were, she was still very much psychologically changed from this event. After the Moore twister, Sarah actually had to wear gun range headphones because any sound of wind at all would send her into a full-blown panic attack. On days where there would be severe weather warnings, Sarah didn't feel safe enough to go to school and would have to stay at home. And really, really tragically, just 4 years after having survived the Moore 2013 twister, Ted would take his own life at just 14 years old. And it is so sad to think about a child being so mentally distraught and overwhelmed and overcome that they take their own lives. It's really almost inconceivable, and we have no idea just how much pain Ted had to endure in those 4 years. Ted and Sarah's family are now huge advocates for the importance of mental health intervention post-natural disaster. Family is also planning to start a foundation called Speak About Your Doubt to help raise awareness, particularly in Moore, where the students who survived Moore are still very young. They're still under 21 years old, most of them. And they undoubtedly still need support, having endured such a traumatic event at a very young age. And I'm glad that somebody is really trying to advocate for those children. There's really not much in the ways of mental health programs still. I know we're in 2022, but we're still not at a point where everyone has access to a lot of the mental health services that they need. And this wasn't the only example of survivor's guilt or apparent trauma that came from the Moore tornado. There are several reports and articles about some of the volunteers who actually worked with Red Cross after the Moore tornado to help counsel survivors. And interestingly enough, all of those volunteers had said that the primary issue after the twister was survivor's guilt. One of the volunteers said, quote, "People were afraid to ask for things like toothpaste because they felt like they were betraying those who had passed away, and they felt guilty because they were still alive." There were a lot of individuals who lived across the street from places like Plaza Towers who felt an immense amount of guilt. There were parents who took their children out of the school on that day who felt guilt. It's a really raw, emotional event for every person involved, whether or not their home was hit at all. In more specifically, after the 2013 tornado, trauma in children really kind of peaked 6 months plus later. So by late 2013, children were starting to behave more erratically. As we mentioned with some of the other studies, children really start to have the realization that they might have some unresolved feelings. Moore Youth and Family Services started what's called Project Moore Hope, and it was really to provide schools and tornado victims information on ways that they could get the mental health help that they needed, either for themselves or for their children, and to refer them to local professionals, which is really an incredible thing for them to have done, because frankly, before this, there really weren't any projects or a lot of resources for people to have. One thing I really want to hit on is that more 2013 and actually 2011 tornadoes between Joplin and the super outbreak, these were really critical years in terms of bringing more awareness to mental health after a tornado, because before these events, really the kind of consensus was that mental health advocacy and help and resources were not as prevalent post-tornado. Before 2011, the unspoken mentality was that you really just kind of sucked it up and moved on. So one of the really important things about the 2011 and 2013 twisters was that they started to bring to light the need for mental health after a tornado. All right, now we're going to switch it up a little bit and talk about the Kentucky tornadoes from December of 2021. Now, there's no actual literature really on that one tornado, the Mayfield tornado, that we have in relation to post-traumatic stress or mental health in general, but I do think that we can still talk about it and have an open discussion. And I was pleasantly surprised about the amount of articles that were openly talking about the need for mental health awareness and for mental health help. So we have an article and it discusses one family who actually survived the Kentucky tornado, and they talked really openly about the hardships that they faced. The father who was interviewed says that he knew immediately after the tornado that himself and his entire family were going to need some kind of professional mental help to overcome the trauma. The father says, quote, "I'm taking it day by day and it's not really fully hit me yet, but it'll hit me when I'm alone by myself." And hot dog, that is heavy. It'll hit me when I'm alone by myself. His 7-year-old son and 9-year-old daughter were in their home in Kentucky along with him when the tornado ripped it apart. And the father says that his children now keep hearing glass break every time they try to go to sleep. Some other people who were interviewed for this article included Leslie Stith, who said the Kentucky tornadoes brought up really intense old memories and traumas from the 1974 Brandenburg tornado. And we've just talked about that one, actually. Leslie was in high school during the Brandenburg storm and recalls 47 years later vivid memories that are never going to go away, that still feel like they just happened yesterday. One of those memories Leslie recalls is coming out of the destroyed high school and seeing livestock walking around with 2x4s in their head. People who went through the Brandenburg storm and really any of the tornadoes from the 74 outbreak still recall the sounds and sights and smells and terror from that entire outbreak, and they were once again triggered by the Kentucky December tornado. I can't actually even begin to think about how many people were probably traumatized from that outbreak who, because mental health wasn't a prevalent topic, never got counseling or therapy and just have lived with those traumas for literally decades. And I can't imagine how awful it must have been to be re-triggered by something like the December Kentucky tornado. All right, the last example we're going to talk about before moving on is Joplin. After the crisis in Joplin in 2011, the city realized very quickly that they did not have nearly enough mental health help services and licensed people to handle the amount of trauma that they were seeing. So one interesting thing about Joplin in the aftermath was that licensed healthcare professionals in Joplin started training those without mental health backgrounds to start a program called Healing Joplin. And I think on any given day of the week, training someone with no knowledge of mental health to counsel someone else is a terrible idea. But given the circumstances, it was really kind of necessary, and it was really a last-ditch effort to help the victims have someone to talk to. So these newly trained volunteers would go around to the temporary FEMA housing that was present in Joplin and talk to the survivors, many of which had really serious depression. I mean, they've just lost everything that they have. And there were even several examples of volunteers who went to talk to one of the survivors, where the survivor was literally on the verge of taking their own life until someone came in and just talked to them. And Joplin, as we mentioned, would become somewhat of an example for being more aware of the mental health needs post-tornado disaster. And the city, which we've talked about this in the documentary I did, is an excellent example of disaster management and city planning. I think for me, of all of the information I've read about Joplin, and there's a lot, I think the pinnacle of tragedy of the Joplin tornado for me, outside of the fatalities, was a man who lived through the Joplin tornado.
It also took one of Matt's legs. That is the most obvious in a long list of hurt.
Ulnar bone in my left arm, I've titanium plates in there still. Compound fracture of my tibia, femur, and sent my kneecap flying. I also endured 2 spinal fractures, skull fracture, severe whiplash that's caused a bulging disc in my neck and a broken pinky. It was about 2 months ago I pulled a piece of wood out of my head again. X-Acto blades and disinfectants, all of that. Pulling, inch pieces of wood out of myself, or glass, gravel.
And you can also very clearly see just by looking at him that he is in a lot of mental anguish over this. I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen an interview that encapsulates PTSD after a tornado more than this one singular person, and it is honestly probably one of the saddest tornado interviews I've ever seen.
A storm rolls through and I shut down. All I can do is shake and cry.
Those in Joplin are still suffering negative mental side effects from the tornado in 2011 today. People are still reaching out for counseling over a decade later in Joplin, just to show you one example of many of how long-lasting the implications of tornadoes are for a community. So after looking at a lot of these honestly dark examples and seeing how many young people and adults are mentally impacted from these events, how many examples of survivor's guilt, documented and undocumented, why do we not talk about this more? The more we do research on tornado-struck communities, the more glaring it becomes that mental health is a huge hurdle in the recovery process. Yet it's something that we never really talk about. And as weather fans, let me ask you a really important question. How many times have you ever watched a documentary where they actually really talked about the mental impacts of a tornado? About PTSD or anxiety? Very few? Maybe once? I always felt that was so weird. It ends like that? I feel like it glosses over the most difficult aspects of the entire process. Why are we never talking about the long-lasting implications of what happens to these people actually? Why are we not talking about the fact that a lot of times funding is extremely lacking and people aren't able to rebuild their lives? Why are we not talking about the fact that some people have lifelong injuries? Why are we not talking about the fact that a lot of people and a lot of children and adolescents experience post-traumatic stress disorders and anxiety and depression? I have a few theories, and I want to share them with you all. And just to clarify, these are all my opinion solely, and you are more than welcome to disagree with them. Let's talk about the I'm fine mentality. How many of you have ever had the shittiest day of your life? Or maybe you see one of your friends that's clearly having a shitty day, and you ask them, hey, are you doing okay? And to save face, they might say, or you might say, if this is you, I'm okay, I'm fine. And when we apply this to disaster recovery, it's a problem. There's this mentality that seemingly immediately follows a tornado event, something that we always talk about. It's people are ready to get back to normalcy, which is not a problem, but let's take a deeper look. How many times have we watched clips of communities, in my videos even, where we hear people say in the middle of their destroyed home, we're okay. We lost our home, but we can rebuild. They're standing in the middle of rubble oftentimes. And I mean, yes, we're always thankful to be alive. I'm not dismissing that. But it's clearly not okay. And I'm not saying this is every single person's experience, but I do see this way more often than not. And that includes a lot of the examples we've looked at. We've seen this a ton of times, even in my videos, where people are clearly not okay, but there's this mentality where, despite the fact that your home and your livelihood have just been destroyed, you want to let people know that you're okay. With such a traumatic and difficult process, even for those who didn't lose a loved one, or a leg, or a home, it's okay to cry. It's okay to grieve and feel a sense of unfairness or feel guilt. And it's okay to really just not be okay. Just because you weren't the worst impacted person of this entire event doesn't mean you're not allowed to feel those emotions and that grief. But for some reason in our society, we oftentimes have this incredibly stubborn mentality where we want to save face for others. We want to show other people that we're strong. And because we want to make sure others get help before we do. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting other people to be helped, but it becomes a problem when it's now a detriment to yourself. People who need help most in disaster areas will get it. People who need to be rescued first are always going to be rescued first. People who need to be treated first are always going to be treated first. But you cannot let that get in the way of you getting some help after them. And I think it's really important that we don't forget ourselves in that process. I genuinely think that a lot of people believe that because they are physically okay, that they are totally fine. But really, the mental wounds are just as critical as the physical wounds are. When a trauma happens, you've got this figurative gash in your brain from a traumatic experience, but because oftentimes we still don't take mental health as seriously as we do our physical health, it gets ignored. And what happens when you have a gash on your arm or anywhere on your body physically? You have to get it taken care of. And what happens when you don't get it taken care of? It's going to bleed. And it's going to bleed unless you get it taken care of. And whether it's a week, a month, 6 months, or a year later, those wounds will resurface at some point. And oftentimes, like survivor's guilt, they resurface when we least expect them to, when we're trying to move on. Again, I'm not saying this is every person's experience, but I am willing to bet that there have been a lot more cases of undiagnosed PTSD and survivor's guilt post-tornado than we will ever know of. One of the other reasons that I actually read about somewhere in a piece of literature, and I don't know where it went, but I do tend to personally agree with. One of the other reasons I believe that we don't talk about it more kind of aligns with my first point, and it's the idea that PTSD has historically most commonly been associated with a war experience, something that soldiers or law enforcement or firefighters have to deal with rather than something that many people in a natural disaster might experience. Despite the fact that we've come a long way in terms of mental health awareness, we're still not completely there. I think that, again, as I've mentioned, 2011 and 2013 were really kind of the first times where we really addressed the fact that we needed mental health advocacy post-tornado. And I do still think that there's a large group of people who don't really believe in therapy or medication. And I just think that it's still not at the forefront of discussion, mental health advocacy in the weather enterprise. Even though we are in 2022, there's still a lot of people who don't really recognize mental health as being as serious as physical health. But studies have shown over and over again that it is very much as important, just as important as physical health. I am aware enough to understand that the psychological impacts of severe weather aren't the first thing that anyone's going to talk about when they see a wedge tornado. I grasp that fully, But when the storm is done and everyone's done ogling at those damage photos and the wind speeds, when homes are rebuilt, there is a big problem, and the problem is that the community is still very much mentally battered and altered after an event. And I think it's especially true for, let's say, the WX community, the sort of storm chasing or weather nerd, weather weenie community, because storm chasing and weather loving is the most predominant thing about the community. I think it's really easy to forget that there is also a large group of people who are interested in weather because they have a fear of weather, and that includes myself. I am someone who is interested in weather because I have a lot of storm anxiety, and I promise you that group of people is also really present and prevalent, and we just don't see them as much. I was actually curious in 2021 how we deal with post-tornado mental health needs, and so I did a little digging just because I want to have the most accurate information possible. The American Red Cross does use licensed therapists to work with survivors to address their emotional needs. So that's great. That's a really good start. But after reading that, my very next thought was, well, how long does the American Red Cross stay to assess the mental health needs? So as I read, I found out that the help that the American Red Cross provides is short-term, which I guess is to be expected. The Red Cross will, quote, identify individuals who need additional support, provide short-term disaster mental health interventions, and then refer them to local resources. So it is better than nothing. I want to be positive about that, but I also have to say I don't imagine how many people are going to then be able to pursue long-term counseling sessions. Even if their insurance covers it, therapy can be really expensive, and I don't know how high on the list of priorities it would be for some people who have just lost their home to have to try to rebuild certain things to pay for expensive therapy. So just seems a little difficult to me, but I digress. So what now? What do we do with all this information? What does the future look like? Well, in my opinion, the first step when you have a problem, when you have a sort of lesser discussed topic like survivor's guilt and PTSD post-tornado, the first thing to do is to talk about it more. The first thing to do is to let it out in the open. Let other people know that these issues exist and show them why they are important to talk about. And despite the fact that I am clearly not fully satisfied with the way that mental health is addressed post-tornado, I will say that we have come a really long way in 50 to 70 years. From having a ban on the word tornado 70 years ago from any kind of broadcast to now being able to talk about mental health and survivor's guilt, I think we are on the right track. And it's still not perfect. We still have a lot of work to do, but we're doing good. Thanks to the 2011 and 2013 tornadoes, thanks to incredible work done by scientists, I think that we're finally getting to a point where we can actually have meaningful dialogue about how mentally impacting these events are for people long term. And if there's anything I would really like for us to take away from all of this, if I had one hope for everyone listening to this today, it's to take care of our mental health with just as much time and attention as we do our physical health. Take a mental break when you need to. Protect yourself, protect your mental health. Check on yourself frequently and check on your friends too. Check on your family. Take time out when you need to. When you feel like you're at a point where you've mentally had it, take a break. Nothing is more important than yourself. I know that was a lot, and I also know that this might have been a whole mess. Because this is the first episode, I want to say a huge thank you to the person who emailed me. I don't want to throw out your name because I don't think that's appropriate, but you know who you are. Thank you so much for your email about survivor's guilt because it really got this whole thing started. I think that's all I have to say. Let me know what you all thought about this down in the comments. Please let me know if you have any other recommendations on specific topics you would like for me to cover. Also, let me know if you have any name ideas for this podcast, and we'll kind of get the ball rolling on making it official. So Thank you all so much for being here today. I really, really appreciate you from the bottom of my heart. I think Blaze is taking a nap, so we're not going to get a guest appearance. Oh, he's coming. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate it, and we will see you all next time. Bye.